This podcast is brought to you by the upcoming Bioceuticals Seminar Series, The New Science of Detoxification with Dr. Chris Shade. Dr. Shade is a globally recognised expert on toxic burden and targeted liposomal delivery systems. He has lectured and trained doctors in the US and internationally on the subject of mercury, heavy metals, and the human detoxification system. In this one-day workshop, Dr. Shade will share his deep understanding on how to restore, manage and augment all three phases of detoxification with profound implications for health. At the end of the day, you will have a full understanding of how to provide a personalised, holistic detoxification program that moves away from the hit-and-miss shotgun approach practitioners may have used in the past. For more information, visit bioceuticals.com.au/education/events.
This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. With me on the line today is Dr. Sarah Lantz, who's a health writer, researcher, author, nutritional consultant, and all-round chemical conscious nut. Sarah's passion for understanding the healing properties of whole foods, plants, herbs, good fats and oils, greens, comes from growing up on farms in country New South Wales. And I will specify Orange, New South Wales, because I'm from there too. From rural upbringing, Sarah went urban and gained tertiary qualifications in public and population health, nutrition, some toxicology, and went on to complete her PhD from the University of Melbourne, Australian Youth Research Centre. In recent years, Sarah has worked as research fellow and lecturer at a number of prestigious universities across Australia, including the University of Queensland and QUT, Queensland University of Technology. Sarah is now the Director of Roots in Nature Proprietary Limited and Buchi Kombucha. She currently runs workshops across Australia engaging people in issues of toxicity of the body, gut health, fermentation and building body resiliency. Her first book, Chemical-Free Kids, Raising Healthy Children in a Toxic World, is a best-selling publication and has now gone into its third reprint, and she's currently writing her second book. Dr. Lantz currently lives on acreage on the outskirts of Brisbane with her two girls and brood of eccentric chickens. Welcome, Sarah. How are you?
Thank you so much. Great.
I've got to say, I was so pleased to learn that you were from Orange, New South Wales, where I did some of my growing up.
Yes.
Lovely.
Does everyone come from there, all the good people? I don't know. I often meet people who come from Orange, you know, or have spent some time in Orange. But I actually think that those rural upbringings where I spent most of my time on orchards and in farming kind of communities on land kind of then went on. I mean, I couldn't wait to get to the city to do all the urban kind of things, don't get me wrong, but it certainly played such a critical role in what I do today, purely based on, those origins or those roots of where we actually come from, where, food was all around us. And, for me, there was just organics and foods and veggie patches and animals. Like I knew everything around me, that was going into my stomach and around me, the health of the air and so forth, where I think that played a really critical role in what I do today in terms of health and wellness.
I think I'd have to agree with you there. It seems, I don't know whether it was just my upbringing coming from a farming background or whether it was living in a country town, but we all knew where food came from. And nowadays people just don't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember going to the butcher and you'd have a whole carcass there and you'd talk to the butcher, and not only would he know where that beef came from, he knew kind of how it was raised, who raised it, how old it is, and, all the gossip around town. Yeah. So, it's interesting. and you could actually say, I want that cut of meat. Yeah. And he used to cut it off. You knew exactly where your food was actually specifically coming from, which I love, and I still love that today.
Yes, absolutely. I think we're losing something of that, with the way that we've distanced ourselves going into a supermarket and buying, the raw packaged item. We've got no idea, but even vegetables, people don't know what a vegetable is from, for instance.
Yeah. And in most of my workshops today, I'll actually ask people, you see, for me, food, in terms of building resiliency, food is the most important thing we can do every day. It's one thing as humans we have to do. You know, I can't think of a more important thing to do. It's on that kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like food is kind of number one, you know. Yep. And yet I ask people, I say, you know, does anyone know where their food comes from? Like specifically the origins. And most people don't. Most people will know more about their children's teachers or, you know, their mechanics or their accountants than what they do about the food that they're putting in their body and that they have to put in their body every single day. And that's really alarming, you know, and I kind of think for me that's one of the first steps we should be doing in terms of building our own resiliency and those of our communities and families as well.
Hear, hear. Now, you're a nutritionist, a lecturer at UQ in public health, founder of Buchi Kombucha beverages and an author of the book Chemical Free Kids. But take us first through your background and how you came to accomplish all of these things, because it's a pretty long list.
I don't know. I've got an eclectic kind of background, don't I, really? But I think it does come from a passion for being on farms. And, of course, you know, as a young woman, you know, I went urban and got qualifications at, you know, universities and, in cities and so forth. But, you know, things such as my interest in health was always there. You know, it was, you know, I went, you know, public health, population health, nutrition. And then I got really interested. So one of the things that did happen when I was in farming in New South Wales is that at one point when I was 15, my brothers and I got glandular fever, and it was something that we couldn't kick. And my parents were cluey enough to get blood tests for us, and they found high amounts of pesticide residues in our blood. And that was like my first, and, you know, of course, at that time, we still didn't know enough about it in terms of the direct correlations or what it possibly could do to your body and so forth. But I think it always stuck in my head as something that I was interested in looking at, you know, because it was such a cluey thing that my parents did at such a young age, is to kind of go, well, what are these pesticides, you know? And pesticides, whilst they weren't often on my farm, I was frequently on farms where I used to run behind the pesticide spray tractors. It was quite common for me to pick up an apple off a tree and it to have the white residue of pesticide and eat that, you know, that residue. It just wasn't something that was, you know, spoken about in our community, you know, or worried about until I kind of got a little bit older and started to kind of join the dots and look at my own health and how I was brought up and where that went from. And so that was my interest in I guess, in terms of looking at chemical exposure or chemical exposure in the body. You know, it was always about pesticides and food first and foremost.
Well, indeed, your research into toxins found some very interesting things in infants, which to me is very concerning. I've read previously that they've found dieldrin in breast milk in mothers in Perth, and that was banned in 1974. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, of course, Silent Spring was that first book that came out with Rachel Carson, which was able to kind of show biomagnification and bioaccumulation. So something that we've introduced, for example, as you said, in the environment 20, 30, 40 years ago is still showing up today, was a really classic example of going, well, what are we doing? Like what's stuck, you know, sticking around, and what's particularly sticking around in our fat cells and in that sort of, you know, an instant. And we started to change the laws, obviously, around these kind of persistent chemicals. And yet, having said that, we've still got more chemicals on the environment in our environment than any other time in history. So yeah, most of my research was initially just starting to look at what kind of chemicals are in newborn babies and working in projects where we could actually examine what's happening in newborn babies. And unfortunately, most of the research we've done, well, there hasn't been a lot done in Australia, and we haven't still been able to find the funding for that yet. So most of it's actually been done in the United States. Yeah. And yeah, they're the first studies that kind of came out even 10 years ago, showing that, you know, over 200 chemicals. And these are just tip of the iceberg. If anyone kind of knows a little bit about toxicology, you know, often in toxicology, it's getting a little bit more sophisticated these days. But in toxicology, we're measuring one chemical at a time.
That's right.
And so when we found out there was around about 200, say, chemicals inside these newborn babies, around 287 to a little bit below that, you know, what we kind of found out was that was really the tip of the iceberg, because we're not really measuring multiple combinations of chemicals. It's just one chemical at a time. But that kind of research was important to highlight the fact that we've got this stuff inside of us. At that time there wasn't even, amounts or not a whole lot of correlation with, particular health outcomes, but it was enough to kind of go, wow, look at all of these immense chemicals. I still get surprised these days when I do presentations because I assume that everyone knows this, and I assume that parents know this and general population know this, and I'm always, really alarmed when I ask people, how many chemicals or what kind of chemicals might be in newborn babies. And literally there's, no people that put their hand up to say what might be in there, for example. We just haven't made that connection between environmental industrial chemicals, many of which we can't see, such as the off-gassing of the paints, for example, or the solvents or the glues, or all of those convenient kind of chemicals such as the non-stick fry pans, etc. We can't see them, and so people don't assume, or people assume that, they're inert and they're, easy in the environment, but they're not going to make their way in their bodies. And yet the research now shows that so many different chemicals are inside newborn babies. And when we're talking about newborn babies, I guess that was we tested newborn babies because it was easy to get the blood. We got the blood cord, etc. And it was kind of like, alarming to kind of go, these are in these children who've just taken their first breaths, for example. But all of these chemicals are inside all of people, all of us. Yep. And so, when I wrote this book, Chemical-Free Kids, which I don't think is possible. I don't think you can really raise chemical-free kids, but we can assist in reducing toxic exposure. I often have to say to people, these chemicals are in all of us. It's not just children. They're in all of us. And we might have different body structures that can eliminate them a little bit easier than newborn babies, but that doesn't mean that we don't have them because we've got all of those as well. So that's sort of my background and my interest in chemicals and where it's come from, really. But
like this research that you've done into umbilical cord blood and looking at the toxin levels that were in there, it's really interesting to me that we know from previous studies where if one chemical has one effect, let's just say it's an estrogenic effect, then if you add 2, 3 or 4 chemicals, it doesn't have a 2, 3 or 4-fold effect. It can have a 100, 200, 300, 400 times the effect. Now, my question is this, is that when does it start to reach a public health issue? Like, when do we start diseases?
That's a really great question. I'd love it if you spoke that kind of language to a lot of the policymakers because they haven't got this language yet, so... we still, if we're talking about in a policy context, we haven't got great legislation in Australia still. We're one of the countries that's really far behind in terms of a Western kind of context and approach to chemicals, unfortunately. Obviously, as you'd know, in 2006, Europe introduced the REACH legislation. And whilst the REACH legislation has some complications to it and isn't perfect, it is the first legislation that put the precautionary principle right out front, as a priority. And we haven't done that here in Australia. You can pretty much get free rein on chemicals these days. I mean, so much of the chemicals we have here have been banned in other countries, for example. And so, policymakers here still haven't made that connection between, most of the time we talk about in terms of toxicology is, low dose or, I don't know if you've heard those terms, but tolerable daily amounts. So there's this idea that you can, have a certain amount of a chemical and it's sort of tolerable on this sort of a level. The problem is, though, is that, as you just spoke about, we don't know those chemical, concoctions, as they kind of increase together or as they kind of meld together, the kind of magnification that can actually happen in terms of hormone disruption or, obviously endocrine disruption and so forth. So most of the time these days we kind of proceed until danger is proven. And the problem with that is that we all have got different thresholds. So, for example, I always use the sunscreen example. We know that sunscreens have, and the Environmental Working Group's done some great work on sunscreens, a whole range of different chemicals in sunscreens, and it's something that in Australia we use really frequently. And yet, for example, if you put on a sunscreen, you might have an immediate dermatological impact. You might come up immediately in sores or scabs or, rashes and so forth. I might put it on and have no impact at all. You bring those results to policymakers, etc., And, it's often chucked out as, something specific to you.
Yeah, idiosyncratic,
and not to the whole population.
That's right.
So, it's a really, it's a problem we have here in Australia in terms of the policy context, because it's actually up to us as consumers to fight for our right to get rid of chemicals. And obviously, as my example kind of explains, it's really hard to kind of get chemicals off the market in that sort of a context, because we all experience them quite differently, unfortunately.
So
and yet we've got some really good policymakers, like international policymakers, who are fighting for our right. The POPs, the persistent organic pollutants, the international committees that are trying to get rid of these sort of, persistent pollutants on an international scale. And that's where a lot of the only real change that's happening in Australia is kind of on that level, because on a kind of a specific Australian national level or even a local level, not a lot's happening in terms of chemical exposure, unfortunately.
But there's a few issues here that I see, and one of them is actually us, the public, and that is I remember a 2004 newspaper clipping out of the is it the Northern Star, the local newspaper that goes to Mount Isa? And I always remember this. I've got it saved as a picture, and it says, "Get bled for lead." And it's a call for the public to come and get their children tested for lead levels, because it's a known mining community where lead levels are high. And yet they had such a problem trying to drum up interest from the general community that they had to offer prizes, including free flights.
Wow.
Because that is
amazing, isn't it? Alarming.
Alarming.
People haven't made that connection, or often when I've asked people questions about mercury or lead, complete neurotoxins, complete nemesis of brain cells. They're going to just destroy your brain. Most of them haven't made that connection. I'll often say, what are these? And you often don't get people who know exactly what they are. They may have heard of them and they may have heard that they're not good, but they don't know the immediate impact, particularly on children, that it's wiped out, families, generations, etc., in different communities, completely wiped them out. And yet there is something that's stopping us from making an immediate personal decision or an immediate kind of impact on our own bodies and our own selves, or that connection between the two is still not there. It's just not. It's not there as much as it should be.
So this is one of the things that I've noticed over the last, let's say 5+ years, is when I first gained an interest in nutritional medicine, there was a complete disinterest from government bodies in toxicology and the potential of POPs, or persistent organic pollutants, organochlorine pollutants in our environment. And there was the complete, falling on deaf ears. And yet in the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen more and more. They're like, no, wait, there really does seem to be an issue here. So is the government starting to listen because there's this groundswell, or are we still...
Well, I think it's actually occurring in different areas. Like, I think it's happening... I don't think it's happening a whole lot on... I think there's an international body that's really pushing Australia. The atrazine was a classic example where it forced Australia to ban, atrazine, for example, a herbicide. It wasn't going to happen. So I think that there's that international, because there's countries like India and China who are banning them before Australia, for example. So I definitely think that's going on. But I also think that there's a really big push from the environment movement, from the marine life, for example, all the researchers in that area as well, because we're realising it's having an impact on not just human bodies, but on marine life, on our food sources, on their food sources. So we're losing, and all of this is coming from industrial chemicals, So I think in that sense, there's more. I mean, often when you talk to, I used to in the past talk to environmentalists, and they used to be all about the, trees, et cetera, which is absolutely fantastic, important to do that. But that internal environment, our own bodies, they didn't really make that connection to, So that kind of thing, what's going on in the environment is actually happening in our bodies. I think that's occurring a little bit more, and from different kind of disciplines. And I think it's happening from a whole lot of different angles. Because certainly when we talk about human health, it's still not necessarily there. When I speak to policymakers or even government, most of them haven't heard about this, or they're not necessarily willing to make changes based on particularly the agricultural kind of sector. That's probably the biggest push, which is pushing back. I don't know if you saw the white paper around food security.
No.
It's largely talking about the fact that food security is going to be a massive issue, with the population growing the way it is, particularly globally.
Yep.
Australia is in a really good position because we can actually grow food and export a lot of it.
Yep.
The problem with that paper, though, was that it spoke about, the same kind of monocultures, industrial agriculture, which is all just still chemical agriculture going on, feedlots and so forth. So in that sort of a sense, there was nothing. There was nothing about sustainability, nothing about organics, nothing about small scale, food sovereignty, our right to know where our food comes from. None of that was actually coming from agriculture. So I think agriculture has a long way to go. And yet I think other disciplines such as the marine life people and some of the environmental groups are actually starting to make those links. And so we're all able to join up a little bit better than what we were previously, I'd say.
Can I digress and talk? It's sort of linked in, but what do you think then is going to be the fallout from Codex Alimentarius? The original thought was to basically protect safe transport, if you like, of reasonable quality foods from India to Australia to Afghanistan to wherever, and know that rice is rice and milk is milk, right? But yet we see continuing issues. There was that contamination of rice last year, 2014, where how many, was it scores of children were killed?
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm wondering, when you're talking about food sovereignty, is Codex Alimentarius going to be a good thing or a bad thing?
I think I think what's going on in most countries, there is a food sovereignty movement, which I kind of really like, I like that idea of being able to know where our own food comes from, grow our own food. I mean, we're lucky in Australia because we've got the land and the ability to do that necessarily. We've got that. I know other countries may need other countries' support to do that. And in that sort of sense, the global pantry could be a good one, but if we're conscious about it, because at the moment it's just like free reign, pretty much, and my understanding and what I've looked at is that not everything is actually assessed when it's coming into Australia. We might have these standards; they're not necessarily always kept up to date, as we saw with the rice, issue and so forth. But I think there is a pushback around food, local food sovereignty, and most cultures have thrived. If you look at civilizations in the past, they've thrived based on their food culture, and it's always been based on seasonal and local. And whilst people argue that that's not essential, people in other places can't necessarily do that. People with in desert areas, etc. I think if we can do that as much as possible, I think we are much more secure as a country, knowing where our food comes from and the quality of it. So it's not just about food, but it's about the kind of quality of food, knowing where that specifically come from, knowing who the farmers are, their work conditions, the soils, etc., is absolutely critical, and I think that globalisation issue around food is constantly being questioned. So yes, I think it's a huge issue.
Really big issue. So just getting back to your research, when you were looking at the toxins in umbilical cord blood, were these toxins that were more likely to be ingested into the mother with the food chain, or were they more likely to be toxins from around the home, for instance, lead paint and, chromium, copper, arsenic from the copper logs and that sort of thing?
Yeah, great question. So we put them kind of into three kind of categories. One was kind of waste byproducts. The things like the leads and the cadmiums and the formaldehydes, obviously, which is a neurotoxin, obviously, but also, some of the solvents, dioxins, the mercuries, the coppers and so forth, PCBs. So all of those are kind of waste byproducts as a result of paper bleaching or, the manufacturing of plastic, for example, all of those waste products. So they're certainly there, and they're usually just in the environment, in the environment, in the air. Certainly things like mercury in our mouths often, not with these newborn babies, obviously, but if they've got parents, with compromised teeth, which is often the case if you've actually, when you think about in terms of preconception care and then being pregnant, and often you have mothers that are quite sick. Yep. We know that things such as mercury is a really, huge issue because we know it crosses the placenta, of course. So, but a lot of these were like kind of the waste byproducts. And then there were the next section, which were the consumer products. They were the things that are going on in the home, the personal care products, the bisphenol A, the plastics, the water bottles, the heating up of food in microwaves, and hand in hand with the bisphenol A and the phthalates, which are all in plastics, and they make plastic soft but also hard in terms of when, like I think about nail polish when I think of a phthalate, it goes on liquid and goes hard very quickly, very similar to that in plastics, for example. So these are all the consumer products, the Teflon, all those convenient things, the Teflon and the Scotch Guard, really handy, prevents stains, but also can actually get through the skin and into our bodies. The non-stick Teflon fry pans, very handy, but they off-gas, for example.
Yeah.
Triclosan is a really big one, and one that's actually going to come up more and more because Canada's doing some great stuff on that. Triclosan obviously is an antibacterial.
Antibacterial, yes. So.
Yeah, it's an antibacterial, and it's in pretty much, anything pretty much that says, all those stuff that say antibacterial socks, antibacterial chopping boards, antibacterial, hankies, antibacterial, tissues. All of those have got a triclosan in it, and they're becoming more and more. And people have shifted, I think, from clean and having a real clean need for cleanliness compared to, hygienic, almost like that disinfected kind of hygienic thing. And that's where triclosan came in. And the big thing about it, obviously, is the move towards gut health, which is what I'm going to talk a little bit about later. But that shift to go, we've got these microbes, and when we use triclosan, we get rid of not only the bad bacteria and the bad microbes and the potentially kind of pathogenic ones, but we also get rid of all the good ones as well.
Exactly.
So there's countries such as Canada in particular who are doing some really great stuff around triclosan and actually, looking at it as a potential, long-term problem for us. But, alongside triclosan and all the dioxins and the plastics and so forth, we also had things like fragrances. Fragrances, as you know, are pretty much in everything. You go into a ladies' change room and there's just fragrances everywhere. Or, the ones that are on the wall that, squirt out fragrances, obviously they're there. And a lot of the parabens and the preservatives and so forth. So there was that kind of layer of waste byproducts and then consumer kind of products that we have in the home. And then the third group was those industrial chemicals, which you talked about earlier, those industrial chemicals and pesticides banned 30 plus years ago that are still in our bodies today. Those classic things such as the DDT, which, our grandparents introduced, which, then got passed on and was sprayed everywhere, first of all in the war, to get rid of mites and mosquitoes and so forth. And then after the war, they brought it into the home as a general pesticide, and then they realised that it's bioaccumulative. So it gets in our fat cells and it's passed on from the next generation to the next generation. So a lot of these newborn babies were being born with pesticides that were banned 30 years ago, for example. And just that, I think that was probably one of the highlights, if you can call it a highlight, of the study, because, it really is talking about, the fact that it's accumulative. And if we, these newborn babies, and it's, I guess, when I spoke to Stacey Malkin, so Stacey Malkin is the president of the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics, she talked about this term, which was chemical trespass. And I really love it because, we've got a generation of kids, including, even ourselves, who are completely being trespassed on by huge companies, some of the pesticides, some of the plastics that, they're taking their first breath and they've already got such a huge range of chemicals inside of them, and they haven't chosen that. They haven't been even privy to that. Yeah. And yet there is a massive trespass. So, some of the intergenerational ethics and lawyers are kind of getting really interested in this idea of intergenerational ethics and the impact of industrial chemicals on, not just this generation, but generations to come.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating. So they're the three kind of categories that we kind of got interested in.
Yeah, well, I remember talking about intergenerational, chemical trespass. The one that comes to mind there was DES. Stilbestrol. It was a drug used, I think, for morning sickness or PMT or something like that. And it didn't affect the mothers, it affected the daughters of the mothers. They got certain cancers.
Yes. Yes, that's a classic one, absolutely, and I think that's what we do that less. I think that was important to kind of when we looked at those generational kind of things to come. People will say we don't do those sort of long-term chemicals anymore. We still do a few. We're much more mindful of that in terms of what's happening in policy changes that have occurred. But I also think we do a lot more chemicals, low dose chemicals that just move through the environment very quickly and through our bodies very quickly. But it's still having such an impact on the body these days, So there's dose-based issues, but there's also, those long-term ones, as I spoke about before, generational ones. And then there's just quick ones, but they're moving through the body very quickly. And, the impact of kind of a body that's constantly being under attack all the time is going to have some impacts on the cellular level at least, or hormonal level at least.
Just talking about a few of those foods, and you were mentioning the different types of chemicals that were found in the cord blood. I remember issues, and what I think we're seeing now is we're seeing things that should not be in the food chain are now leaching through from industrial waste into the food chain. So, for instance, there was I believe it was a Choice magazine expose some years ago on fish that was imported from Thailand laced with flame retardants. There was also lead found in cocoa that we sprinkle on our coffees, and all of these real big issues. So from that sort of comment to a question, from the findings of your research and those comments, what do you think needs to happen to be addressed for future generations?
It's a huge one. Like, I think how we do society around toxic chemicals is so bad, And it's not just that, because it comes down to the core. It becomes a huge issue because it comes down to the core of how we do life. How we do business, how we consume, how much we consume these days, the marketing. So I think it's a really huge one. I think that Europe took some great steps with introducing the REACH legislation and starting to implement a precautionary principle, which essentially means that companies really need to prove, that what's in there, or that at least they need to identify through MSDSs what's actually specifically in their chemical, what, if any, have a toxic impact or a toxic load on the body, or that of animals as well, before that's actually able to be released onto the market. Now, this has caused quite a bit of uproar in Europe because there's it's slowing down, obviously, These days, we're able to produce a product and get it out very quickly in Australia or other countries. But in Europe, they're starting to question those, can it go on the market before it's actually tested? And often the case is, they're actually stopping these kind of, chemicals actually going out into the environment before they're actually, rather than what we actually have today, which is proceed until danger is proven. So I think, at the core of it, it's a big question because I think we have to start questioning how we, what we consume, how much we consume, and what kind of companies we actually are going to support. And I do think that the dollar counts. We've got an opportunity to spend that dollar on, vote with your dollar, really, because there's some really great companies doing fantastic stuff, and we need to kind of definitely create a standard around that and say, I'm not willing to put up with that. I want that, and unfortunately, I think in Australia, we're a very compliant society often, because even in chemical, but there's not a whole lot of an uproar around all of these kind of chemical exposures. But I do think it's important that we actually start having a voice around them and kind of really questioning, companies, and the way we do, kind of ethical companies or not ethical companies and why we're doing that. I mean, it's crazy how we do kind of consumerism these days. Yeah.
I think leading on from a previous comment you made, one of the biggest sadnesses, I think, that's happened is, and I mean this as a generic term, not as a brand, but what I call the Dettol generation, and that is that that it wasn't just hygiene, it was sterility. We needed, and you still see it in TV ads today, you need that kitchen bench top to be absolutely sterile for it to be a good, healthy family environment for your nice, beautiful child. And that's not the case because we're wiping out these important, these vital microbes which we interact with on a daily basis to cause us health. And even when we start to wipe out some of these supposedly bad guys, as long as they're in low levels, they're actually doing as good, not bad. Yeah, absolutely. That is being, and we know that the hygiene hypothesis
is, a really interesting one.
Absolutely.
The hygiene hypothesis, which was talking about the fact that, we've got this kind of, you're absolutely right, this Dettol generation, and we now know that these Dettol generation are getting sicker as a result of wiping out their immune systems, wiping out all the good bacteria, all the bad bacteria, but also all the good bacteria. Absolutely. And I think that that's a really critical one. And you see it all over if you watch television, it's very antimicrobial, very antibacteria based.
Still.
And I think as a generation, we've kind of, that's the way we've gone.
Yeah,
as opposed to being clean, and also having some of those germs around and having those microbes around. And I think that's what comes back to me, coming back to our origins. It was encouraged for me growing up to go climb trees and to, go roll down, mountains with, mud and stuff,
Mount Canopolis.
And I was swinging off things, absolutely. That's what we did, that's what we did growing up.
Yeah.
And it really was about going, you get stronger and healthier, and all the research is showing that. But we've actually gone the other way these days.
I know, it's really sad. And I yearn for the day, like, for instance, we accept now with yogurt and probiotics. I yearn for the day that a food will say contains germs. And let's talk about that, because you actually make fermented food, which involves germs.
That's a good lead into it, because absolutely my background was all around toxicity of the body, and you can actually spend so much time talking about chemicals, but it can be really kind of like full on. The last question you asked me about what do we kind of do about it, because it's so big, the issue. So for me, my step was going, well, what solution, or what kind of, if I can be part of the solution in some ways, what could I offer? And for me, a big one was actually setting up a fermentation, kind of collective, and a fermentation company. And that's where Roots in Nature actually came into. So, I'm a director of a company now, which is all about gut health, because most disease occurs from the gut. And it's all about, developing that symbiotic relationship with microbes, essentially. And the more we see and more we read the research, the more we're actually seeing how critical these little critters can actually play in our lives, essentially.
Now, when most people think about fermentation, they probably think about either spoilage of food or beer manufacturing. So tell me about what you're doing, because there's actually one of these fermented foods that's really good for our gut.
Yeah, so, I think the key to health really these days in terms of reducing toxic exposure but also building resiliency is through fermentation. And I think the key to health is finding a way to optimise our gut health. Now, one of the ways to do that, and absolutely you can do it, and people are talking about probiotics and capsule forms of probiotics, and they can be absolutely critical, which is all about really essentially living microbes and getting as many living microbes back into your gut, essentially, and back into your body, essentially. Mm-hmm. But I guess fermentation is the origins of probiotics. Most of the microbes in ferments have never been grown in a lab. They're just something that historically we've actually, used and developed and grown and developed a relationship with. I mean, Michael Pollan talks about fermentation as he says eat some foods that they themselves have been pre-digested by bacteria and fungi. That's his kind of definition of fermentation. Fermentation really is it's designed to restore the integrity of our gut by increasing the number of beneficial microorganisms. And that's, in a nutshell, kind of what it is. It's also designed to preserve nutrients and break them down into easily digestible forms. So something like a cabbage, ferment that, and the king of the ferment world is actually a sauerkraut. It's got so many microbes, more than what you'd actually ever get in a probiotic, bioavailable, for example. Mm-hmm. But it is actually more easily digestible, and it preserves more nutrients than the original form. So, as we actually preserve it, or as we actually ferment it over about 2 or 3 weeks, it breaks the cabbage down into an easily digestible form, which is just teeming with bacteria, for example. And it increases the nutritive value. The other thing I just love talking about in terms of fermentation is what you spoke about earlier, which was it really creates a protective environment against harmful pathogenic microorganisms. So, in theory, putting fermented foods into your body not only just increases the microbial count, and if you get enough of them and also a wide variety, you get a different family, lots of different types of different microbes. But also, their job really is they're kind of like the ninjas of the gut lining, essentially. So their job is actually to kind of create like a protective lining. And so, inevitably we are going to get viruses and we are going to get some colds and some flus and so forth. And if our body theoretically is strong enough and it's got enough microbes, they'll be able to actually fight most of that off. It doesn't mean you won't ever get one of those, but it'll actually be able to, the microbes will be able to fight off and create that kind of protective layer in your gut as well. So, I mean, that's really exciting. And all the research that's coming out about that is really exciting. But, that whole area of not just ferments, but gut health. And there's a lot of really interesting work coming out about that. And some of the, one of the probably, I get really excited when I talk about this, but most of our friends, the microbe word, they're largely single-celled organisms. Millions can fit into an eye of a needle, which is really exciting. And get this, there's more microbes on a person's hands than there are people on the entire planet. In a lot of ways, that sort of information is really interesting because when we use triclosan or some of those antimicrobial gels, when you think about it like that, we've actually just wiped out all the bad stuff, but also all the good stuff. We've wiped out, all those microbes, that exist on the entire planet on our hands, essentially. And it's important that, in a lot of ways, people are talking about humans less as humans and more as kind of we're like a host because we've got obviously more microbes or more microbial genes on our bodies, in our bodies, than actually human genes in our bodies. Absolutely. Which is fascinating, So our job, in my mind, when you look at all this research, and Gershom wrote that great book around, the gut-brain kind of connection there. The more we learn about it, the more you realise that instead of destroying these microbes, our job really is to create a relationship with them and a really beneficial relationship with them. And fermentation is certainly a really easy way. And an easy way that families and parents and people in everyday life, like you don't need anything very special to ferment, but to kind of really easily bring gut health back into their lives very simply.
So we've mentioned things like sauerkraut. There's other cabbage ferments like kimchi, of which I think I remember reading there was it 160 official ways of making kimchi? But anyway.
It's enormous and it varies. I went to China last year and they were very particular about kimchi because if you went to, a woman next door who was from Korea, she had a very different way and hers was the authentic way, she used to tell me, compared to the Chinese woman next door. So everyone's got, compared to the Singaporeans and the Malaysians, they all had different ways of their authentic kimchi, but certainly kimchis are really remarkable.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then we've got, tofu, which, from the much maligned soy, but the fermented product, the tofu, again, various ways of making it and various benefits. There's so many other foods. I mean, gosh, if you wanted to go really weird, you could go to the Inuit who stuff fermented penguins under their bed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so... But I want to talk a little bit about your speciality, and that's kombucha. Now, how did this evolve from a lifestyle choice for you into a thriving business?
For me, it was more of a passion. So obviously I was talking before about looking at chemical toxicity. When I was doing my postdoc research, which was all about kind of policy and looking at comparing different policies around toxic exposure or just chemical exposure. And I was comparing Europe, Australia and the US. When I was actually doing my postdoctoral research, I kept drinking this drink because I'm really obviously into fermented foods. And generally, I kept drinking this drink over there called kombucha. Didn't actually know what it was. This was 5 or 6 years ago. Didn't know actually what it was. Had a lot of fermented foods in our lives. And I was at a research symposium over there in San Francisco. And then I just one day just got more and more interested in it, to a point where I was just having kombucha all the time. And it was such an easy drink. And so I started thinking to myself, well, this is a really easy way to get, obviously in Australia, besides when I ask this question at ferment workshops, people often don't know, all the stuff that's fermented, or even if it is fermented in Australia, it's usually been pasteurised. But, probably we don't have any cultural kind of ferments. When you go to China, kimchi, Europe, etc., they've all got their specific ferments. All ancient cultures have got a ferment. In Australia, we haven't got anything. And there's people who, probably have gone through most of their lives eating dead food. And so the closest thing in Australia we had was probably beer, as a ferment, which has usually then been pasteurised.
That's right.
Yeah, but, when I was in the United States, I kept thinking this is something that I could bring back and really introduce it very easily into kind of families' lives. That and also water kefir, milk kefir. So beverages were something that we could easily kind of do. And so we just started doing, got back to Australia, looked around on the market, and there wasn't anyone. There wasn't anyone doing kombucha on the market, because I just came back just craving it really, or craving a similar kind of a ferment.
Yep.
And so we started brewing ourselves largely, and then it just got a little bit more, and then we'd, friends and family and so forth would want it, so we'd start bottling a little bit more. And so for something that went from a couple of cups a week or maybe a litre a week, we went to 10 litres and 20 litres and then 100 litres and so forth. And then, at that point, then we went, well, actually, this is something I love to do. And it was a combination of producing an organic beverage that was a fermented beverage, but also being able to talk to people. It gave me an inroad that I didn't necessarily have in academia, and still don't necessarily have. The research in academia is brilliant, amazing, but it didn't necessarily give me an inroad into talking to families and community. And that has always been my speciality. That's always been my passion. I love working with families. And so producing a product and then being able to produce a company and grow a company that we could produce a beautiful product as well as do workshops. And so every 6 weeks we have fermentation workshops where we just talk about microbes and gut health. It's exciting. That's totally exciting stuff for me. And so that's where it's kind of, come from. But we didn't anticipate it. We bought 20 bottles the first week to our organic market up in Brisbane. It was snatched up in 20 minutes. So the next week we bought 25 and then 50 and then 100. And then we thought, we need to actually start getting a bit more serious here. And it was just one of those passions that grew into a business as opposed to, artificially enforcing something. It was something that just sort of grew very organically. And I guess our philosophy has been, in a lot of ways, it's, for me, implementing what I preach. So if I talk about ethical businesses, if I talk about, organic and food sovereignty, then for me, it was creating a business model that was actually able to fulfill on those things. So our brewery, for example, doesn't have plastic in it, for example.
Yep.
We avoid those sort of any kind of, we're certified organic. We know all of our farmers. We brew in oak, all of those things. And so it became a model which, we've got other companies coming to us and saying, how do you do that? Because the mainstream is often very chemical-laden kind of path to do it. And so I guess in a nutshell, that's where it kind of come from.
Can you explain to me, though, well, firstly, I think what kombucha is, because my mindset is that it's this sort of wet mushroom that's sort of floating on top of a,
you're not far from the truth.
Okay. Well, can you explain to our listeners what kombucha is, how's it made, and also the safety factors that they need to be aware of if they're planning to make it? Because I understand years ago there was a bit of a scare, and I don't think it's, I think it's something people need to know about how to make properly.
Yeah, absolutely. So all fermented foods are something that you have to be like anything. You have to take care in making sure that you get the right ingredients, you've got the right conditions, you've got clean everything, for example. So kombucha is essentially, if we're talking specifically about kombucha is something that's been brewed for 2,000 years. It's always been around, and it's essentially a fermented tea. It doesn't taste like tea at all, so it starts off with a sweet cup of tea. Yep. So something like a black or green tea or a rooibos tea. And we actually put it, you can use it as sugar, you can do a rapadura, you can do a honey, which is more of a jun sort of style of kombucha. But all ferments need a carbohydrate or a sugar. Our job as brewers is to brew out that sugar. It's the one thing that the microbes love and can convert into organic acids and enzymes and so forth. But on top of that sweet cup of tea, you actually introduce a microorganism called a SCOBY, a symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast. You essentially put that actually on the tea. It's an aerobic ferment, so you actually put a cover on it and you just let it do its thing. And it may take a week or two. It expands to the size of the vessel. It creates a baby essentially on top. Yeah. And it's one of those microorganisms that grows, it feeds on the tea and sugar. And in that process, it converts all of those sugars and all those tannins in the tea to a range of different acids and organic enzymes and bacteria and yeasts and so forth. And after 2 weeks, your job as a brewer is to actually brew out all that sugar, and it tastes kind of got a little bit of a kick to it. So it doesn't really taste much like a tea. It tastes like a kombucha, a kind of a fermented beverage. And then from there, you can actually take it off, drink it as is, or you can get a bit fancy with it and add in things such as ginger, turmeric, galang, or pretty much anything you wanted to and bottle it off essentially. Yum. Yeah, and it's a really easy way of actually creating a ferment at home. Now, the things you do have to, as you said before, in terms of health and safety issues, kombucha's never ever been proven to have caused any reactions, at all, except for everyone is different with fermented foods, and this is kombucha, kefir, sauerkraut, whatever.
Yep.
Fermented foods can actually, detoxify really quickly. Or it's that classic thing, as if your body doesn't feel like it, don't have it. It's when you smell a product and you just can't get it in mouth and you think, oh, someone told me it's good for me, I've got to consume it. Yep. It's one of those things, that can actually have an adverse reaction to you. You could get bloated, you could get gassy, you could get diarrhea, all of those sorts of things. And essentially what you're doing is introducing a range of new microbes into your body. Yep. So if you're not used to having fermented foods or even probiotics of any, or even living food for that matter, it can be quite an onslaught into your body. So it's just a slow kind of process. But having said that, fermented foods generally just have got all of those, as I said before, those benefits to it. It's like a lemon. It's very hard to contaminate kombucha. It's like a lemon, so it's really acidic, but very alkalizing to the body, so it's really hard to contaminate it. However, having said that, it's like any food. You have to take care of it. You have to look after it. If you're making a yogurt at home or anything, you have to make sure that the conditions are right. You have to make sure that your brewing practices are well thought through, and you're using all the best ingredients and so forth. So I hope that gives you an indication of kind of cleanliness or hygiene issues.
But they can learn from your business how to make kombucha, correct?
Yeah, it's a growing. I think that's the thing that is really interesting. We were talking before about kind of movements that are going on. Fermentation is certainly a movement that's growing. And I also think things like pickling and canning and knowing where our food comes from, that is certainly a growing movement. I still think it's a small proportion of, in my world, it's like the whole world operates in that kind of level, but I step outside of it and I realise most of the population still eat fast food and junk food, or a lot of those, population. Yeah. So I still think it's small, but it's a growing group of people. I mean, when we started 5 years ago doing fermentation workshops, it was much smaller than what it is today. There's more and more people catching on to the whole idea of, most disease occurs from the gut. So really I need to increase my microbes and maybe cleanse out some of the microbes that aren't so good.
So are you saying, though, that you said earlier that kombucha, some people shouldn't take it, but what I'm picking up is that maybe they should start off with a smaller dose, not necessarily avoid it.
Yeah, absolutely. And some people, like if you've got families with kids, I'll often say to kids even, start with some sauerkraut, start with some really, and just little bits of it, start with a little bit of milk kefir, but just little bits of it, start with a little bit of kombucha and have a little bit of it. It is just starting very slowly and then building your way up. And it's kind of trusting your body, absolutely, and seeing what your body particularly feels like at that particular day. It's like, I talk a lot about gut health, but, one of the things is trusting your gut. And when you do get kind of clean, in my experience, people can actually start feeling, what do I actually feel like today? Is it protein? Is it fat? What kind of fermented foods? And I generally say to people, it's not even you need a huge amount of it. It's like, when you go to China or, any of the Asian cultures, there's always like a pickle on the side, or there's some bit of cabbage on the side, or something funky on the side. It's not a lot. It might just be a tablespoon. And that's all you really need to start with. It's not a lot, but it's something that we need to start introducing to our plates. If you're going to have a good roast, add a little bit of sauerkraut to the edge of it, for example. So it's something that's just little by little, but eventually, in my experience, I found that the more people who have fermented foods, the more you feel like it as well.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I think you raised a very good point there, is that sometimes people think sauerkraut, cabbage, but they're thinking about cabbage on its own or sauerkraut on its own.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. Well, you think about cabbage mixed in with a beautiful roast beef. And then the flavours come out, and that's where the beauty comes out. So it's this holistic use of it, not as a single agent. I think people need to get back to, how they were used culturally. As you said, the pickle on the side.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. We have the same experience. People look at it and they just don't know how to use it. And it's totally just a little bit, and try it, add it to this, try it, add it to that, and it can totally enhance a meal. It's like pickles. And people, even with sauerkraut, people will be funny about sauerkraut. Pickles are not so bad about, or not so funny about, but it's culturally the way they were actually raised.
Yes.
But I think you can use fermented foods in so many different ways, and you can get and you can do like long ferments, like a kombucha is a slightly long ferment, or sauerkraut's even longer than that. But you can do really quick ferments. You may actually just want to do an aerobic ferment of some of your fruit to break it down over, like half a day or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So some of them can be actually, or you're doing a salsa for the night, you can actually just, make sure you make the salsa, give it a bit of an aerobic ferment and leave that out for, 12 hours and have it during the evening. You asked about some of the possible issues. So one of the things which I was almost about to forget, but I'll say now, fermented foods can potentially have alcohol levels in them. So when you ferment something, there could be trace amounts of alcohol. And so that is something that you really need to be kind of mindful of. So if you're making a salsa, for example, sugars in tomatoes will actually ferment, quite sweet.
Uh-huh.
So you will actually get you never get high alcohol content in any way, but just to be mindful that you may actually get up 0.5% or something. And that's something just to be mindful of, where some of the kombuchas and some of the kefirs will actually, or could potentially get up a little bit higher. So just something to be mindful of.
I remember in my uni days brewing some home brew Cooper's beer, and we added just a touch too much sugar. That increased the alcohol content.
That would, absolutely. That and a yeast, because it's mainly yeast. It's like a ginger beer. These days
right.
Ginger beer is, because it's literally just yeast and sugar. They love each other. They're the ones that actually create, the ethanol in it. So beautiful if you want to actually ferment, Oh, and to be honest, I kind of like the idea of, if you do want to make an alcohol, you do want to make a beer, you do want to make a mead, try making them at home. It's a whole tradition that we've actually lost.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think part of fermenting is actually claiming back our past, because generations ago, a sourdough culture would be passed on from the next generation to the next. At some point, particularly in the last 50 years, we decided bacteria and microbes, were not good, and our job as humans was to try and control them. And they're always going to win these days, and they're totally winning these days.
Yeah.
But, we were told that they're not very good, and so we kind of lost all of those old traditions. And I think what's going on at the moment is a bit of a revival of those fermented goods, and that's reclaiming your sourdoughs and, bringing back, grandma's pickling and canning and so forth. All of those are absolutely critical to our own health and the health of our bodies. Absolutely.
Now, you wrote your first book about chemical-free kids, and that was talking about your research into the umbilical cord blood and the toxin levels.
Yep.
But you're also writing a second book. So now I want to sort of combine them. So how did your research lead into writing your first book? And with your second book, where are you going to take this with regards to what you're doing at the moment with fermented foods?
Yeah, so the first book was it's quite an academic book, it was that classic first book. I really like it, but it was written in a classically, a way which was quite academic, really evidence-based, fantastic, in that sort of sense. So it was largely about what's going on, how do we measure toxicity of the body, what kind of chemicals are in the body, what kind of chemicals are in things such as, I worked with Bill Statham, who wrote The Chemical Maze, a fantastic man. And, it was all about what's in personal care, products, what's in baby products, what's in some food products, that kind of angle, a little bit on food, but mainly on personal care products and baby products and so forth, and unpicking each one of those chemicals and so forth, which was fantastic. I think, and then my next book that I'm doing now has moved into not just chemical exposure and reducing chemical exposure, because I think reducing chemical exposure is absolutely critical. And, these days the most chemical exposed place is actually in the home. And so in the home, given that that's just got so many chemicals in it, it means it gives me kind of confidence and a bit of hope as a mother, because then I can actually choose what's going on in my home. And so one of the areas that I started exploring a couple of years ago was not just reducing toxic exposure, but the reality is that we're going to be exposed to toxic chemicals. And so how do we build resiliency? So, what I got really interested in was that idea of food as core business. And it's absolutely core business in my home, in most people's homes, and something that, is something we had to do, as I said before, every single day. So this next book is about how to build resiliency in our bodies through food. So it touches on not just what's going on in terms of chemical exposure, that's the first kind of chapter. But it also then goes through, what can we actually do to build resiliency? And it critically kind of touches upon and works with organic farmers.
Yep.
Really, if we want to actually start looking for solutions, organic and biodynamic farmers are absolutely the key to kind of really changing how we do things. They're already doing it. And that's something that could actually transform not just, our own bodies, but, the soil, animals, plants. It's one of those holistic kind of ethical approaches that we could do. So this book kind of talks a lot about food sovereignty and food security. It then goes into some of those really practical things, such as fats. How do we actually use fats and how fats have historically been used and how they've kind of been, kind of demonized over the last couple of years and how we need to reclaim good fats. And also, very importantly, talks about microbes. And that's always my passion. So it was all about, how do we actually build resiliency through good fats? How do we build resiliency through good microbes and through good fermentation? So it gives some examples of that. And the other one is obviously water. How do we address water? So obviously water's got most significant amounts of chemicals and hormones and endocrine disruptors in it. So how do we create a good water? So it's that sort of that information, but also some solutions. So that's the second book, which is being edited at the moment and will hopefully be out on shelves within the next 3 months.
This is fantastic news. This is all the stuff that we really need to be doing in our everyday lives. And you're now going to be giving us a practical instruction booklet as to how to achieve that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're hoping to do that. Yeah, definitely got the evidence there. We're just, I'm co-authoring with Tabitha McIntosh, an amazing naturopath in Sydney.
Yes. And
so, yes, we're actually at that last bit of trying to pull together really practical solutions at the back. So not just giving people the information, but also saying, well, what do I need to do? And what area do I need to tackle? Because when you kind of look at these areas, you've probably experienced, I've experienced it, it's completely overwhelming. So it was about, for this book, tackling kind of some big issues, but also some everyday issues that we could do, which was meant to be a really easy manual.
Am I allowed to ask the title?
Do you know what? I can't even tell you the title because we don't have one yet. The title I was coming up with was so academic. It was something like, food sovereignty and building body resiliency, and when I'm working with our editor, which is Peppermint Magazine, it's gorgeous, they just looked at me. They said there was something so unsexy about that title. I said, okay, could you guys come up with it? So they're editing the book at the moment. So I'm hoping at the end of this, we'll have a really fantastic title, and we'll make sure you're going to be one of the first people we let know about what that title is. It's terribly embarrassing because most people start with the title. Yep, we haven't got that yet. It's going to be probably the last thing we come up with. Yeah, well, so I hope it's a good one.
Well, Dr. Sarah Lantz, I can't thank you enough. I really do applaud you for all the work you've done, not just in a more academic arena, but also bringing this back to the people, because this is where it starts and ends, is bringing this instruction book for lifestyle to the masses. So I really applaud you for what you've done.
Thank you so much.
And I will tell our listeners, please look out for Dr. Sarah Lantz, Lantz, and her upcoming or forthcoming publications, and including Chemical Free Kids, her previous publication. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today on FX Medicine. I really learned a lot.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Love being here. So thank you.
This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook.
This podcast was brought to you by the new science of detoxification, advanced approaches to phase 1, 2 and 3 support. For more information, visit bioceuticals.com.au/education/events.